On March 28th, 2010, Fox aired the 15th episode of Family Guy's 8th season. In this episode, Stewie found an old script that Brian wrote called What I Learned on Jefferson Street. Brian rereads the script and was surprised by the quality of writing his younger self was able to produce. He was proud of his accomplishment and wanted Lois to read the script. Now, it's a bit of a running joke that Brian is a pretentious pseudo-intellectual, so Lois wasn't eager to read the script, but after a bit of pestering, she caved in. Lois ended up liking the script so much that she called in some favors from her wealthy father to get Brian a meeting with some CBS executives. Brian pitches the script to them, they like it, and they decide to make a TV drama out of it. Brian's vision for this drama was for Elijah Wood to play the lead role as a single father in his mid-20s who decides to go back to college in hopes of giving his daughter a better life. The executives liked this vision at first, but ended up making a lot of changes based on market research. The final product ended up being a show starring James Woods instead of Elijah Wood. The plot changed to being about a middle-aged man who goes to college with his 18-year-old daughter. They changed the format to a sitcom, and they changed the name to Class Holes. The CBS executives were more concerned with chasing ratings than they were with presenting the public an honest work of art. The executives Brian met with liked the original script, but instead of taking a bit of a risk, they produced something they thought would be safe based on trends. This episode was particularly interesting to me because it gave a bit of an insight of how TV pilots work, even if it is, oversimplified and exaggerated for comedy's sake. Sometimes it can be easy for me to get so lost in the magic of cinema and animation, I forget the media I consume is a product of a larger industry that exists under the same realities of any other industry. Shows and movies are expensive to produce, so executive producers who finance these projects have to decide what is or isn't worth their time to invest in. There are a lot of business considerations that go into these productions. Unfortunately, these considerations sometimes take a front seat to the artistic visions. I can imagine this dynamic Family Guy described in this episode affects a lot of projects. I'm no expert nor am I an industry insider, but I couldn't help but to think of the movie Cuties while watching this. Cuties is a movie written and directed by Maimouna Decoré. It's a French coming-of-age story about a French Senegalese girl from a very traditional Muslim family who feels caught in between the values of her parents and fitting in with her peers. The movie examines how young girls internalize hypersexualized images of women. They see the attention women get for dressing and behaving in certain ways and want to be validated in the same way. They are then conditioned to think that women who aren't received in the same way as a Kylie Jenner or whoever have less value. This makes some girls form their sense of worth and value on how they look, how much attention they get, and the number of likes they get on posts. Race, class, and culture interacts with a young girl's ability to meet these standards to get the validation. The movie doesn't explicitly go into this, but there is a scene where the main character tries to straighten her hair with an iron to look more like the white girl who lives in her building. The main character doesn't come from poverty, but she doesn't initially have the social media presence, clothes, or hairstyles needed to be validated by her peers because her parents don't value anything that is a close enough approximation to any of that. Her classmates who don't have immigrant parents but come from low-income families would face a similar reality of not having access to the cool aesthetic, but just for a different reason. With the ever-increasing availability of smartphones, tablets, and computers, increasingly younger girls are being exposed to this feedback loop. Things aren't like how it used to be when I was the main character's age. Smartphones weren't really a thing back then, computers were still really expensive, and the internet wasn't practically slow. Kids have always been exposed to these sorts of values criticized in this movie at school or from TV shows, but it wasn't always in their faces like it is today. Of course, social media and technology aren't inherently bad things, but it is good to be aware of how certain aspects of these things could affect child development if left unchecked. I don't want to spoil anything about this movie, but I will at least say that it's inferred at the end of the movie that the main character is on the path to finding a healthy balance between the values of her parents and modern French values. Now, I can't really say I'd ever recommend this movie to anyone, but I can't honestly say it's a bad movie worthy of condemnation. It is much better received abroad. It was nominated at the Berlin International Film Festival and won the World Cinema Dramatic Competition at the Sundance Film Festival. The movie wasn't deemed controversial until it was picked up by Netflix and was more widely accessible for US audiences. The main controversy of this movie comes from the US promotional poster that was very racy in comparison to the original French posters. The initial Netflix trailer was also very misleading about the type of movie it is. They made it seem like it was pretty much like the Mighty Ducks, but with 12-year-olds twerking and shit. This made it seem like twerking was being portrayed as a normal thing for them to do instead of it being criticized. The controversy over this movie can pretty much be broken down into two categories: flack from people who watched the movie and flack from people who didn't. People who actually did watch it argue that the casting process reinforced the same things the movie is critical of. Roughly 650 girls auditioned for roles in this movie. That means over 600 girls walked away thinking the reason they weren't picked was because they weren't pretty enough or they didn't dance provocatively enough. It's also really weird that dancing provocatively was part of the audition process for a bunch of preteen girls. The other main critique from people who actually watched the movie is that many recognize the film has the potential to be stimulating for individuals who struggle with pedophilia. Many feel as if sexualized images could be triggering for pedophiles and cause them to act on their feelings of attraction. The reactions from people who didn't watch the movie are from conservatives and people who just didn't want to watch a movie with a bunch of little kids twerking. The second group is pretty simple. I get it. The conservative reaction to this movie is a bit more complex and interesting. Modernizing trends of the Roaring '20s, along with European immigration to the US, caused cultural shifts that created an unprecedented clash between urban and rural American values. This clash became known as the Culture War. The specific points of contention change as time goes by, but culture war issues are consistently about the traditionalist take on whatever the current social issues are versus the progressive take. Right now, these issues include things like criminal justice reform, abortion, immigration, and LGBTQ rights. There is also a similar divide when it comes to more economic issues like minimum wage and graduated income tax, but this isn't typically considered to be part of the culture war. Sure, the culture war may influence how the public understands these economic issues, but this concept is more about race, gender, and religion than it is about economics. The people of the US who fall more on the traditionalist side of the culture war tend to be right-wingers, vote Republican, and/or identify as a conservative. These right-wingers, particularly the religious right, tend to see the entertainment industry as the paragon of degeneracy and progressive indoctrination. They think this because late-night TV shows have at least a somewhat left-leaning slant. Shitting on Donald Trump is low-hanging fruit for comedians at this point, and entertainers in general tend to be big on left-wing activism. We are also in the Me Too era. The creepy shit people do within the entertainment industry is finally being called out. Everything from sexual assaults to child molestation is being uncovered. The biggest scandal would definitely be Jeffrey Epstein. He was a Palm Beach, Florida-based financier and socialite who was found dead in his jail cell while awaiting trial for his sex trafficking charges. He had been preying on young children for decades and had even pled guilty to procuring for prostitution from a minor back in 2008. This guy was able to get away with all this because he had heavy connections in politics and in the entertainment industry. If he couldn't buy his way out of something, he can influence his way out. The 2019 Epstein case sparked a national conversation about pedophilia, sex trafficking, and the elites of our society abusing power. Now, no matter where a person's politics are, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who isn't against this sort of thing. But US conservatives have a very interesting relationship with the elites and their power. Generally speaking, they don't seem very concerned with abuses of power in general, especially if it falls within their in-group. They actually tend to support policies that favor corporate interest and the wealthy, which helps secure elite statuses. So it's not really about solving the issue of abusing power for them. It's more of a tribalistic sort of thing. I can also see that it may be easier for them to get worked up about Hollywood or Democrat scandals because they already perceive the left as being degenerate. Left-leaning people tend to support LGBTQ rights and tend to be pro-choice. Any scandal that a Democrat or Hollywood type is caught up in is confirmation that left-leaning ideals are inherently flawed and produce bad behavior. When it's a Republican or conservative public figure, it's more or less brushed off. In the eyes of many conservatives, Cutie is one big confirmation of everything they think about left-wing politics in Hollywood. It's a bunch of everything goes degenerates who are so inclusive that they'll accept anything, even pedophilia. As long as it's in the name of diversity, those sick fucks will accept anything. An unfortunate fate fell on the movie Cuties that I will call the class holes effect. They had a good idea, a good vision, great message, but fucked it all up because they were trying to be as marketable as possible. Just like the CBS executives in the Family Guy episode, whoever the hell was in charge of marketing this movie in the US fumbled the ball. They probably looked at some trends and went, US audiences seem to respond more to poppy colors and scantily clad women. So they decided to change the original poster to this shit. Now this promo would have ordinarily been fine, but they kind of forgot that the scantily clad women in the poster weren't quite women yet, and child sex trafficking is a hot topic in this country. Whoops. In my opinion, the controversy about this movie is blown out of proportion. There are plenty of things to criticize about this movie, but calling this child pornography is complete nonsense from people who couldn't be bothered to know what they're talking about before talking. Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz. Now, this does not mean that I'm downplaying the concerns from people who did watch the movie, though. I agree it was inappropriate that hundreds of little kids danced provocatively as part of their audition. I did a little bit of research on the casting process, and it does sound like the parents of the children were involved in the process. A child psychologist was also present. But I still do think that a lot of the social scripts the movie is critical of may still be reinforced for the girls who didn't get selected for any roles, especially if we consider that they didn't have a continued relationship with the psychologist like the cast members did. I also sympathize with the concerns people have about the movie being a trigger for pedophiles that could make them act on their urges. There is a lot of research that shows the relationship between viewing child porn and molestation. Many people question if this can qualify as porn to a pedophile. I personally have mixed feelings because nothing about this movie codes as pornographic to me, but there is a scene or two with brief zoom-in shots of the children's butt while they're twerking, and they did this weird, floor humping dance. Suggestive dancing hardly counts as pornography, but I wonder if children engaging in that behavior is enough to trigger a pedophile to act on their urges. This is a difficult thing for me to weigh in on because the research out there is vague about what they're calling child porn, but I'm under the impression they mean sex and nudity in these studies. So there isn't any real evidence that suggests that dancing or dressing a certain way has the same relationship with molestation as child porn does. I'd imagine that viewing media with young girls being sexualized could pique the interest in child porn for pedophiles, but I'm not sure I can agree with the idea that these girls are pedo bait. I personally take issue with this term because it puts the onus on the child instead of focusing on the issue. Some people are just pedophiles. Most people who aren't pedophiles would just see a bunch of kids who need some guidance. If a person gets anything else out of that, then that's a them issue and there's really no proof that they'll act on it. I walked away from this movie feeling a weird, heavy feeling. It made me confront a reality that is very foreign to me as a man. I've been conscious about some aspects of the realities of being a woman in Western societies, but it really bothered me to see these social pressures affecting little kids. It also bothered me when I realized that I tend to write off women and girls who struggle with these insecurities as shallow instead of seeing them as real people struggling with an unhealthy sense of self-worth. It can be especially hard for me to sympathize if the person is conventionally pretty and acts shitty to people. This movie made me realize that I may not be as progressive and down with destigmatizing mental health as I thought. I have a bit of a blind spot here. Thanks for watching. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Thanks.